I've often wondered how they could begin again. I think about the disciples and the followers of Jesus, and Easter morning has happened, and they know that Jesus was no longer in the tomb. But what a strange place to be. For at this point, what they are left with are Jesus' teachings, his joy, his hallelujah, his message to indeed love God with all your being, to be at peace, and to hold every breath, every word, every action as sacred in a oneness with God that they had never known, in a oneness with God that they had witnessed as Jesus expressed himself. I wonder how they could go on. Well, it was in this week that words started to get out. There were visions, there were appearances of Jesus, and it began with Mary Magdalene. Jesus spoke to her in the tomb. And then later he spoke to others, including the disciples. What an amazing experience that must have been. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked because they were afraid of the Jews, it was then that Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then after he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And it was then that the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father had sent me, so I send you." Well, the disciples heard this message and they were overjoyed with love, for their Rabboni, their teacher, had now come to them again, and he was calling them out. He was saying, just like I taught you, you are the ones to go forward. You know enough. You've got it. It lives in you. Bring that message out, but it comes in peace. So can you imagine the joy of the disciples to see their beloved teacher? They were all aflutter. So, I think about that, and I like that little word, aflutter, and I think I would have been all aflutter myself. My God, my God. All of them, that is, except for one. There was one disciple that was missing at the time, one who wasn't there, and he heard all about this amazing experience. But he was a bit skeptical. He was a little doubting, as you might say. It was Thomas. And so Thomas heard about this, and he wasn't exactly sure what to make of this. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said, "Unless I see the mark of the nails on his hands, and unless I put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Can you relate to Thomas? Can you imagine if you're a bit of a thinker, if you are a little bit skeptical, if you are in your human nature, then you might recognize that this is a hard place to be, right? It's a hard place to understand. It's a hard place to go. But it is a funny thing because Jesus then came to Thomas. And when he saw him, he saw the marks on his hands, and he saw who he was. And he said, my God, my God. I think about times like that for all of us. And I think that sometimes we have a critical experience and we are defined by that moment. Have you ever made a mistake in your faith? Have you? Right? Don't even ask me, okay? Have you ever made a mistake? And then have you ever been identified by that mistake? People, even when you want to forget, people want to remind you, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to Thomas. He became known as Doubting Thomas, right? When you think of Thomas, don't you think, oh, Doubting Thomas? Well, it's an interesting thing because he just had that moment of real questioning, of real doubt. But he, like us, have those moments at times when we say seeing is believing, which comes from our human understanding, our human consciousness. And there are times when if we go deeper, what we recognize is believing is seeing. When I come from the place of faith, then I can see what my mortal eyes cannot see. I can hear what my mortal ears cannot hear. And I can feel and know what my human understanding will not allow. This is exactly what happened to Thomas until he had this moment. But here's the good news about Thomas. He had that moment, but he was more than that. Did you know that Thomas was one of the disciples, now an apostle, now a teacher, who went to India? And he shared the good word of Jesus' teachings to Indians, so much so that the Syrian Indians became known as the St. Thomas Christians. They're called the Nazrani in India because they link their spiritual lineage back to Thomas. That is the impact that Thomas has had on people in the world even today. And so I look at Thomas and I recognize that in his soul's way, he resurrected his spirit. Do you see what I'm saying? He was not defined by his humanity, but he resurrected from the Christ of his being, from his true nature, and he went out and he shared that which he knew, and he inspired people. And they fell in love, and they were empowered by the teachings of Jesus. Thomas did not let his moniker, Doubting Thomas, define him. He did not allow that to happen. So take a moment and think about the different names that you have been called. I knew you would laugh. But think about the name. Oh, let me put it a different way. Think about the names you've been known by. So start to let that come back to you. And some of those names will have been very sweet. Some of them will be very kind. Some of them will be really funny, right? Some of them are not even true. Some of them might be a little hurtful. Some of them might be a bit unfair. And some of them define you in a moment. And some of them define you from your spiritual nature. So you have a lot of different names in your experience if you've lived a few years. I know that I have had a few names that I've been called. So there have been some names for me. For example, when I was a little kid, my name was Yaya. My little sister, Cindy, was born when I was 5, and she didn't know how to say Myra. So she would say, Yaya, Yaya. And I remember being at a school spring performance, in grade school, and I'm on stage with my class, and way, way, way in the back is my little sister, Cindy. The place is quiet, and I hear, "Yeah, yeah!" Oh, I wanted to crawl in a hole. And then when my brothers, who were 14 and 16 years younger than me, were born, I was in high school, and a high school friend of mine just reminded me a couple weeks ago. She said, "I remember when your brothers used to call you Yaya." And I thought, wow, some things never end. Okay. Well, I moved on from that delightful name, and then as a young lady, I was called Moonbeam, and I can only let you imagine why. I was a little bit of a space cadet, right? I was called Moonbeam. My children called me Myra June Bug Banana Nose. I don't know why. And then most recently, Harlow, my little redheaded, we call her our ginger Asian granddaughter here, she calls me Grandma Two Moles. I know, you can laugh. It's terrible. I have a mole here and a mole here. And so she says, "Oh, it's Grandma Two Moles. It's Grandma Two Moles." And she'll say things like, "Grandma, do you still have your moles?" And so and I keep trying to push that aside, but her mother keeps influencing her. And she's hoping that name will stick. So don't support that. Don't support that. Grandma Myra works just fine. Have you ever been called names, Michael?
Well, as a matter of fact, yes. Not Moonbeam, but...
Oh, good.
Yes,
Thank God for that.
I remember growing up, when I was really small, actually, I was very quiet and kind of a shy, compliant child. And in my household, children were kind of to be seen but not heard. So that was the place for me to be, and just to be quiet, because that was the safe place. And so that was the label I had for myself: just be quiet, just stay back. And I found one thing that was very helpful out of that came that in doing so, I began to listen to what other people were saying. And I began to become aware of people would talk about this and talk about this. And the white stone, the gift for me out of that was beginning to see balance between different sides and different ways of doing things. And then in high school, when I got into high school, I was doing sports and I was on the wrestling team, but I wore glasses. I wore those like big, thick, black raccoon kind of glasses, which probably are back in style now, or maybe they're back in style and gone again, I don't know, but these glasses, right? So I was trying to be this macho wrestler with these raccoon glasses. It was a real struggle. And people, of course, would call you, four eyes, you've heard that before, and maybe raccoon face. So it was a struggle for me. And I realized after a while that what was happening was, through that process, was I was beginning to develop some inner strength. And I actually look back at my high school manual, and they put names and quotes, under all the seniors. And this was a quote that they just put there. I didn't find it. It was by Edmund Burke, and it said, "He who wrestles with us sharpens our skills and strengthens our nerves." So the gift for me out of that, the new label, was beginning to birth an inner strength.
Oh, nice.
Then many years after that, I was married, and then actually went through a terrible divorce. It was just really hard, and I lost everything. I lost the marriage, I lost the business I had just moved out of Boston to North Carolina, lost my support group, if you will. That was my identity at that point. I was just lost. I had never felt so alone. Mm-hmm. And I was inspired. I was at that point in San Diego. I went into the public library there and pulled out a copy of Emerson's essays, Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays. And I went over to the copy machine, which at that time wasn't a little small thing. They were just huge. These big desk things, and had a big floppy rubber thing on the top. You kind of stick the book down and fold that over and put in your dime, and you got one copy. Well, I did that, and I copied all 68 pages of that essay. and read it, and I was inspired, so much so that my new white stone, my new label was self-reliance that I learned from that essay.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I think you bring up a great point, and that is that our name is something that we can choose as spiritual beings to define ourselves by. Sometimes that name is given to us, and sometimes it comes to us through guidance. You know, I think about the Catholic tradition, and when nuns take their vows, they are given names of saints. And in the Buddhist tradition, when you become a monk, you're given a Dharma name. And that name is sacred to you, and it's sacred to your essence of who and what you are. And Native Americans go through what is called a naming ceremony. And the elders pray, and they pray, and they pray, and they hear the name of that person, whether it's a child or an older person who desires to know their spiritual name, their spiritual calling. And so you see, the power of a name is important because it gives us focus. It gives us direction. You went from lost to self-reliant.
What a change.
I went from moonbeam to minister. You see, all things are possible. But names are very, very, very important because they help direct us to where we are going. And so today we're going to move into a white stone ceremony as we open up to the power and the richness of listening to and discovering what is our name at this point in our soul's evolution.
So we'll begin by moving into a time of meditation. I invite you to relax. I invite you to close your eyes. And as we begin, I'll ask, does everyone have a white stone? If there's anyone who doesn't have a white stone and something to write with, just raise your hand and the ushers will find you and give you one. So take a deep breath. Become still. We are open to allowing God to express through us, express as us. I invite you to take your white stone in your hand and see it as a symbol of new life. Behold, the Christ in each of us says, I will make all things new. So this white stone is a promise of a new life. It is our sign of a clean slate. Whatever has gone on in the past, we let it go. The disciple John wrote in Revelations that the white stone carries a new name for us. It's your spiritual identity. It's a deeper awareness of what God has planned for you. It has come to you to be lived out, to be expressed, to be embodied as you. It is what God is calling you to be, to do. It is a whisper from your soul that you are so much more than you have ever let come into expression. So listen to this question and answer it for yourself. Who and what am I called to be for myself, for others, for the world? Listen. As you're guided by Spirit, trust in this now moment. As Spirit gives to you in this sacred place, in this moment of truth, an insight into your divine purpose, an insight into your holy essence. I invite you to allow yourself to hear the new name that God has for you. As you ask, who and what am I called to be for myself, for others, for the world? As that name becomes clear, just allow yourself to write it on your stone. It may be a title, it may be something like love, or published author, or clean and sober, or grateful, whatever it may be. Take your time and listen. If your name doesn't appear to you in this moment, that's just fine. Just relax. Continue to listen deeply and stay aware for it to come to you at a later time. Stay aware and keep listening. And if your name has already come, I invite you to stay quiet and allow yourself to ask for a deeper understanding. To ask if there's any steps to take. Allow yourself to simply be open to Spirit. Remember, it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And after you've written your name on your stone, I invite you to carry this white stone with you as a reminder of who and what you are called to be.